You're watching JoCo in the Know, a public service program co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Johnson County and Johnson County Community College.
My name is Paul Johnson. I work as a legislative liaison with the League of Women Voters in the state of Kansas. I monitor budget and tax policy questions for them, and I write weekly e-reports. And they asked me to moderate this distinguished panel tonight to talk about Kansas tax policy and where we're headed in the future and the changes and the opportunities we have with tax policy in Kansas. So I'm going to ask our distinguished panel to self-introduce themselves before we get started. So, Professor?
I'm Bill Black. My primary appointment is in economics. I have a joint appointment in law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and I'm a former financial regulator.
I'm Karen Wolf Kol. I'm Executive Director at United Community Services of Johnson County. We're a community planning organization that focuses on human services.
I'm Senator Tim Owens. I'm an attorney, and I represent the 8th Senate District, which is basically the center part of the Johnson County area, mainly with the northern part of Overland Park. Represented the Senate now, represented that district in the Senate for 4 years, and prior to that I was in the House of Representatives for 7 years.
I'm Representative Arlen Siegfreid. I represent the 15th District, which is primarily the west side of Olathe. I've been in the House of Representatives for 10 years, and I'm currently the House Majority Leader.
Great. So the governor started off this legislative session with a major tax proposal. And since that time, over the last 70, 80 days, the Kansas House has taken a look at it and come up with a version of the governor's tax proposal. And the Senate as well has come up with a tax proposal at this point, and now they're in what's called a conference committee where the House and the Senate versions are being discussed. The most common property or proposal in these three different versions is a phasing down, eventual elimination of first the personal income tax in the state of Kansas, and then secondly corporate income tax in our state. It would be a major fundamental change in the state of Kansas, and it should be given very careful consideration. When you look at the big picture here, in 2011, when you add state and local tax payments, revenues together, it was $12.4 billion. So per Kansan, your share is about $4,300 a year for that, or 11% of personal Kansas personal income. So out of this $12.4 billion, 32% is made up of property tax, 28% is made up of the sales tax, and then 24% is made up of income tax at this point, 4% for motor fuels, and 12% for the rest for other fees and that. So this 24% that's income tax equals about $2.9 billion in the state of Kansas in 2011. So I guess my first question in this is, what are the opportunities and the risks and basically the fairness of phasing out the income tax in Kansas? And I may ask the good representative to start the discussion for us.
Well, Paul, I would just like to start out by saying that our goal when we start this is to create a tax structure that promotes economic growth throughout the state, is simple and easily applied and understood by the citizens, and taxes as broadly as possible and at the lowest rate possible. Now that's our goal to start with. In the governor's plan, we basically agreed with the governor's goals in the House of Representatives, but as people will tell you, the devil is in the details, because broad concepts are wonderful, but when your constituents see details, they become concerned about them. And two of the details in the governor's plan that immediately began to draw attention was the doing away with the mortgage deduction and doing away with the charitable deduction. There were some other business deductions, the historic tax credit and things like that, that also drew quite a bit of attention. So we immediately tried to reconstruct the governor's bill to meet those goals without creating those problems, and to find a way to address the concerns of our constituents. This is a never-ending task when it comes to taxes in the legislature. We go through it every year, but the goal of doing away with the income tax is based on the fact that there are 9 states in the United States that have no income tax, and they seemed to survive the most recent economic downturn much better than most other states did. Kansas did not do, I don't think, did really terrible during that time. We're blessed because our agricultural income stayed very strong throughout this, while our manufacturing income, I think, dropped by about 12%. And we managed to come out of this thing looking fairly decent, and we definitely are on the upswing right now. But we want to keep that going because we're facing significant challenges when it comes to Medicaid, as the federal government is withdrawing their support for that. And as you all know, we had a very well advertised problem with CAPERS that has to be financed. We can't finance those things without growth. And so we are looking for a way to grow the economy. And I just note one other fact. I think it was the very last year of the most recent recession, Kansas was dead last out of 50 states in job creation. We can't stay there. We have to find a way to create job growth in the state of Kansas.
Well, I can't disagree at all with you know, the goals. I think that whatever we can do to grow the economy is certainly what we need to do, like any other state. I think the concerns that the Senate has focused on more is a concern about the property tax impact, and so the focus that the Senate has taken is how can we maintain or lower property taxes, because I think it's the most feared tax there is. In terms of the approach that the governor would like to take in reducing or eliminating the income tax, the biggest concern there is if you do that, where does it take you, and where do the abilities of the state to maintain its obligations to the people, where does that come if you eliminate one complete tax? Certainly maintaining the income tax or the sales tax that we increased a year ago, 2 years ago, is one way to at least have a transition. If we were to do that, we certainly can't eliminate them both. I think one of the comments that the representative made I strongly agree on, and he and I both served on the tax committee together in the House when I was over there, and that is that we have so many sales tax exemptions and other exemptions on property tax and income tax that I think we need to take a look at a number of those from the perspective of what is our return on our investment by giving those incentives or those exceptions. And if we can find a way to justify those, if we can get a transparency of them so that when we look at those exemptions that we've given and it shows that there's a return on our investment, I think that's going to be a valid approach. But if we can't show that, then we're going to have a different tax reform approach. It may well be that the consumption tax approach is where we need to really be looking, and I know that there is a strong contingent of fair tax folks who would like us to look at that, and that gets into that question. I know that Senator Kelsey was a very strong advocate for a consumption tax approach. He modified the fair tax view from that by addressing the taxes on groceries. And I don't know that we're there yet. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on it, but I'm not going to be as encouraged about moving too quickly on an elimination of the income tax until we know where we're going to be if we do that. And my biggest concern is that we may be like a lot of these other states that have been referred to, a higher property tax, and I don't think that's what my constituents want.
Part of your question was, is this proposal fair? And I would say in terms of our lower income residents in the state that it certainly isn't. Analysis of the governor's tax plan showed that lower income households would actually be paying more taxes. So I would say it's not fair to provide tax relief for everyone else at the expense of our low income households in this state. And the number of those households is growing, certainly in Johnson County as well as across the state. So I don't think it's fair, and it's not equitable. Sales tax are certainly a much more regressive tax. So if you're lower income, you're paying a higher percentage of your overall income in terms of sales tax. And so when you look at it that way, I think there are other elements of this tax proposal that need to be considered. There are certainly many opportunities within tax policy, which I'm not an expert in, but opportunities within tax policy to benefit those families that do struggle financially. Things like an earned income tax credit, child care credit. There are a number of proven effective strategies that can address some of those issues of equity within the tax code. And so I think those are some of the things that need to be considered as we're looking at how do we change tax policy. I think there are some significant risks with this kind of change. You know, raising taxes on working poor not only increases poverty, but it may be also harmful to the state's economy. There are some studies that show that if they're paying more income tax, then those dollars aren't available to be spent in the economy, because for the most part, low-income families are spending all their money in the economy. And so, again, thinking about those kind of risks that we're countering, as well as the long-term impact of not helping families really move out of poverty. And the tax code can help with that if it's structured in certain ways.
Well, when we teach public finance about these issues, first, it's a policy issue whether you want the number of people paying taxes to be greater or smaller. If you make the number of people paying taxes greater, then poorer people end up paying a higher percentage of their taxes. By definition, they're the people who can least afford it. And particularly if you're seeking to expand employment, to make your jurisdiction unfriendly to lower income people is not a particularly good strategy for doing it. So it isn't obvious. People can disagree as to whether this is an appropriate goal or not, and that's why we have elections and legislators. But from a public finance standpoint, it isn't obviously better to have a bigger tax base. I would point out that the 4 taxes that you've talked about are really very different kinds of taxes. Historically, most states have wanted to have diverse sources of taxation. So the income tax, everybody sort of understands that one. But the sales tax is a tax on consumption, which is a very different concept and has very different implications because primarily what you've just explained, poorer people are going to be buying, using a vastly greater percentage of their income to consume. The property tax is a hybrid. It's really a wealth tax in many ways, and we haven't really talked about that. Some people consider that much fairer, who believe taxes should be based on wealth versus income. Other people find it appalling that you have a tax on wealth and almost un-American and such. But we tend not to think of that conceptual difference as much perhaps as we should when we focus on it. And the corporate income tax, well, you know, lefties types usually hate, usually love the corporate income tax and hate evaders of the corporate income tax. And there's tremendous evasion of the corporate income tax. To economists, it's actually less clear. It probably, certainly to the extent you have a universal corporate income tax, it probably acts most like a sales tax. In other words, it's probably passed on to the consumer. So the lefty types are probably wrong about the corporate income tax and some of their real strong support for it. There are lots of other things, but time-wise, I think I should stop here, have a discussion as opposed to a lecture.
If Boeing's selling a jet to China, then we want them to be paying the corporate income or sales tax. But well, so let me shift this towards sales tax, since that's got a lot of play, and there's been variations in the House and Senate and the governor's proposal. As the senator said 2 years ago, the sales tax was increased in Kansas by 1 penny. It went from 5.3 to 6.3%, and it was used to cover budget shortfalls in Kansas. And the plan was that after 3 years, it would go back to, it wouldn't go completely back to 5.3 where it started. It would only go back to 5.7, and that difference between the 0.3 and 0.7 would be used for our transportation highway plan that was passed 2 years ago. In the governor's proposal on income taxes and changing that in Kansas, his suggestion was that we do not roll it back from the new 6.3 to 5.7. And I would caveat here, this is just the state sales tax. Localities like Johnson County, various parts of Johnson County have higher local sales tax that add on top of that. But and the governor's plan was that instead of rolling it back, you would use that extra sales tax money to offset some of the loss in income taxes. When the House took up and debated it on the floor, they decided that they had made a deal with voters that they were going to roll it back to 5.7. There was a similar thinking on the Senate side. What was particularly unique about the House version and their discussion of this was that they decided to go in and take sales tax off groceries in the state of Kansas. Kansas was one of 6 or 7 states in our country that have a full sales tax on groceries. Many states have a partial sales tax, like Missouri only has a partial sales tax on groceries. And when you factor in the full cost of taking off the sales tax on groceries in Kansas, it's about $270 million a year. The Senate did not go along with that proposal at this point. And the tax conference committee between the House and Senate conferees that have been meeting for several times and trying to hammer out the differences between the House version and the Senate version, they've initially agreed that Kansas cannot afford to take it off groceries, so that may be out the window as we speak. But I guess my general question is, what is the economic development trade-off for Kansas between lowering the sales tax, such as groceries, versus lowering the income tax?
The economic trade-off is not very good. If we are going to go back to the theory that no income tax is better for economic development, and you can certainly find a lot of studies that would seem to prove that factor. The problem is, are they done with static or, and I just lost the other word.
Dynamic?
Dynamic scoring. And everything that we have right now is static. So I'm not certain how accurate any of these studies are. We actually have to get to dynamic scoring, which shows the actual overall impact of the action you just took. But if we are going to go to no income tax, we are obviously going to go to more consumption. The rationale by the governor, and politics are not always rational, but the rationale by the governor, if we're going there, why take it off? Well, we take it off because when we had a really serious debate about this and a fairly close vote on the floor of the House at least, there was a promise made by those voting for this tax increase that it absolutely would come off in 3 years. They are not going to back down from that promise. We're in an election year, and they're not going to go home and say, oh yeah, I decided to break my promise to you. And so it came off. As far as the tax on groceries, it has a long history. I think it's been passed out of one house or the other in the state of Kansas about 11 times and has never survived the conference committee. And it is a very good political vote. But if we are, in fact, going to no income tax, is it rational to increase the hill we have to climb by $270 million? And I think that's what the conferees, it appears they're going to make a decision that that is not rational if that's where we're going. And for those at home, it's interesting to understand that after all the debate that goes on between the two houses, 125 in the House and 40 in the Senate, these real decisions in constructing this final tax bill are made by 6 people in a conference committee. That is the way it works. Now, we'll all get a chance to vote on it, but that's where it comes from. But that's the rationale. If you're going to go with no income tax, you have to move towards covering more of your expenditures through consumption taxes.
You know, I'd like to focus a little bit, since we're in Johnson County, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I certainly agree that we're going to, if we eliminate the income tax, we're going to have to move toward one of the other taxes. If the property tax is a hated tax and not something that we want to go to, it leaves that third leg of the traditional stool, and that being the consumption or sales tax. One of the statistics I've always found to be really fascinating here is that Oak Park Mall, right here in the middle of Johnson County, actually brings in more sales tax dollars in a year than 56 of the 105 counties in the state, collectively together. So when we start talking about consumption tax and we start talking about where that's going to come from, we get back to that question about, you know, well, Johnson County. Johnson County is going to pay for a lot of these things, and we hear that constantly in Topeka. And so a reality is that if we do go that route, we have to be fully cognizant that a lot of the money for the state is going to come out of Johnson County and potentially out of some of the other metropolitan areas, but this is basically where it comes from. So I think that's a big concern. I do want to address also something Karen said. I agree, certainly, that anything that we would do with regard to consumption taxes is going to have to address the issue of the disparity that could be there with the poor and the low-income families. But I do think that the direction we need to go is to try to find a way to spread the base so that it's not that middle sector, the middle class, that is arguably a diminishing, vanishing class, I think, anymore. But we've got to find a way to spread the base so that we can lower the rate for them. And in order to do that, you have to pay attention to the entitlements on the one end and to the exemptions and the benefits on the other end. And how you get that balance is truly what I think the policy question that we need to come to is.
And I think the other question is, for me, again, not being, you know, a tax expert, is on the other side in terms of the revenue. And we talk about lowering taxes, but the corresponding conversation about what do we really need to provide for the kind of services and quality of life that people, particularly in Johnson County, are expecting and wanting. Good public schools, good public safety, the social services, those kinds of things. And so if we're talking about these changes in tax policy and less revenue, what does that do to the other side in terms of the kinds of services that are needed that benefit all of us? It's not just people who might use those specific things, but really improve the quality of life, which is in part what brings business into the state and in turn then does help build the economy and create jobs because businesses want to be here. So that's the other side of the whole tax debate that I think about is without that revenue, what path are we going down and what kind of state do we become and who would want to come here and bring their business?
So let me take on Texas directly. As the purported model, I taught at the University of Texas for many years. And there are very few people in Kansas, I think, that would like to be in Texas. It is a state where its budget surpluses, to the extent there were surpluses, came because the price of oil exploded, not because of the policies, and most assuredly not because it didn't have an income tax. Dynamic scoring is the concept that when we cut income taxes, the economy will expand, and so we should assume that expansion and assume that the budget revenues portion of the budget will expand. That is not proven to be true, and indeed I would say that overwhelmingly economists believe that the Laffer curve is, like the name implies, not a serious thing. It has been discredited every time. What you see, yes, there are a number of states that came out of the crisis, or to the extent we've come out of the crisis, they're in relatively better budgetary shape, and some of them do indeed have no income tax. They also happen to be oil patch states overwhelmingly. So we have not, in fact, proven that getting rid of the income tax is any spur to growth. It can be quite the opposite, right? It can be quite the opposite in two different ways. One of the members already pointed out that Kansas was doing very poorly in job creation. That should be a cause of immense concern, right? Job creation is one of the biggest things going forward, and in Kansas, you have the beneficiaries of a huge explosion of commodity prices, which is one of the reasons Kansas's recovery was fairly good. And you have Johnson County, which is essentially Kansas in terms of growth, right? In terms of population growth, if you take Johnson County out, Kansas isn't growing, it's shrinking. If you take Johnson County out in terms of its economic growth and income growth, Kansas is shrinking, right? So it's incredibly disproportionate in the state, all of that, what is happening in this single county, which is dependent on a model of really high education, right? That's what makes Johnson County different, and why 70% of the counties of Kansas lost population in the last 10 years, right? Here you have a pocket of really high education, and it works for that pocket of really high education, but if you can't keep up the Kansas university system, it will not work going forward for Johnson County either.
Could I respond to that?
Sure.
Professor Black has pointed out some things about Texas that are true, but I would dispute one thing. I don't know whether Kansans want to live in Texas or not, but we have problems with something they call absolute domestic migration, and we actually lose more population to Texas than we do anywhere else. One of the other states with no income tax is Washington State. That's a beautiful place and is not, I wouldn't certainly consider them a regressive state. The only thing they have really in common with Texas that I know of is that they have no income tax. At this point in time, since we're not growing jobs here, our model is not working. Now, thankfully, we are starting to produce a few jobs, but right now we're using tools that actually do away with property tax for new businesses coming in here. I think we've had 2 businesses come into Overland Park just within the last week that are large businesses coming out of Missouri. And if you will track down the kind of breaks they've got, I think you'll find property taxes mixed in there. Apparently we can afford to do without those property taxes for 5 to 10 years. And property taxes are extremely important to our educational system. Senator Owens and I, when it comes to property taxes, have joined the rest of the Johnson County delegation almost unanimously voting to support increases in the LOB, which is an increase in property tax. And the local control of allowing our local citizens to decide how much they want to spend on education. Because truly, our education system is working and working well in Johnson County. Not, you know, there's always improvements can be made anywhere, but it is working very well in Johnson County. But you hit the nail on the head. We're paying 27–28% of all the bills of Kansas out of one county. Something has to work for the rest of Kansas. And it even becomes more difficult when you consider that Sedgwick County is probably paying 20% of the bills. So now you're up to 47% of the bills for Kansas paid out of 2 counties. We have to find something that works for the rurals, that will expand our economy in the rural areas, and that's what we're searching for now.
So maybe the third topic I wanted to cover tonight, which kind of gets into maybe an angle that the governor's thinking about in his tax proposal. He wants to eliminate what's called the non-wage income for individuals, income tax filers. And this would apply specifically to folks who file as a limited liability corporation, a subchapter S corporation, or a sole proprietorship. And kind of put this in a bigger picture perspective, in 2009 we had 1.3 million Kansans filing taxes. 15% of that 1.3 million filers, about 191,000, had used some form of limited liability corporation, sole proprietorship, etc. In the governor's proposal, he wants to eliminate this income to Kansas all in 1 year. In the Senate version of the governor's tax proposal, they agreed with that to do away with it all in 1 year. The House took an approach where they would phase it in over a period of time. And maybe the good professor can correct me here, but in listening to the discussion on tax policy in Kansas, I think Kansas would be unique in completely eliminating this income tax for these particular filers. But so I guess my question is, what kind of detail do we have on these filers at this point, and what would measure a successful outcome if we made this step? And maybe I'll go to the good professor here to.
Well, actually, we were talking before we began this about the lack of data that we have in what really happens with many of these breaks and who's actually receiving the benefits. And I would, say what all profs say, which is you need to study these facts, and I think my colleagues on this panel agree with that strongly. So the first answer is we don't know as to a whole bunch of these things, and big bucks depend on it, and important policies in trying to establish different models for different parts of Kansas. And we can't make those decisions very well without the facts. And I know our colleagues here are trying to get actually some of those facts through the legislative process.
I know I've asked for a legislative post-audit dealing with a couple of the programs that we certainly hope are going to be successful, the PEAK program, the PEAK 1 and PEAK 2, and then the HPIP programs. What I'm seeking is
you may have to explain a bit of that jargon,
okay.
just to
Well, this is why everyone wants to stand next to us at cocktail parties.
Promoting let's see,
Employment
across
across
Kansas
Kansas,
is
yeah.
what PEAK stands for. We started with a program, PEAK 1, which was an incentive program to bring businesses into the state on the condition that they would also bring employees and employment and new jobs into Kansas. PEAK 2 came along because the businesses already in Kansas were concerned about a fairness aspect and said, well, what about us? Do you want to keep us here so we don't leave? So PEAK 2 came along. So we have those programs. As an example, they started in 2009. And the question I've raised is, I think it's great if they're working, but I'd like to know, what is the return on our investment? When you give away certain things that tax that has to be paid, and I think it's 95% goes back to the business, 5% is retained by the state for operational costs. But when you do that, how do you measure the benefit to the state in doing that? If you measure it by the number of jobs that come in, how do those jobs then contribute to the cost factors that the state has to endure for its various programs that it needs to do? And I wasn't able to get a very good answer, although I will say the Secretary of Commerce gave me some information, and the Secretary of Revenue provided some. However, that I don't think there's a lot of follow-up as to that side of it. I think we're entitled to know that, and I think that would be really good if we could do it. And so any of these tax incentive programs, I think the way to find that out is through the legislative post-audit that the professor was referring to. And you know, I just think that's something that's appropriate for all of us to know when we're going to be participating in any of these incentive programs, just to know what's our return on our investment.
I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
There's a broader question as well for the nation as opposed to Kansas or even Johnson County. At best, this competition among the states is zero-sum. And at worst, and if we think worst is most of the time, it's negative sum, right? You end up not getting sufficient return as an overall system to provide the infrastructure that actually would attract jobs. In a better world, corporations would be paying just like other people would be paying, and they'd be getting useful services and such from the state, and they would locate where people had strong educational packages and such, you know, University of Kansas, K-State, and every other state, every other university anyone listening you know, went to. I'm not trying to pick favorites in Kansas and such. So we have diverted an enormous percentage of our time in the legislature, in professional groups at the city level, county level, every level of government you can imagine, and such, diverted to these kinds of negotiations that in the end don't create any new jobs for the nation and probably cost jobs for the nation. So, you know, in some sense it's a race to the bottom, and the only way to win a race to the bottom is not to race.
Let me see if I can tackle one more kind of the structural issue of the governor's proposal that I think has an overarching impact on what's going to happen with availability of funds for various services in the state of Kansas. And the representative may have to help me with the exact number, but the governor's proposal was to cap revenue growth in the state of Kansas to a certain percent. 2%. And then any, what?
2%.
2% revenue growth, and anything that went over 2% would then be used to starting to scale down in individual and then corporate income tax. On the House floor, that was raised to 3% at this point. On the Senate side, that provision was dropped altogether in the Senate tax bill. Now, concerns that I've heard, you know, in the law around the Capitol, et cetera, and trying to pencil this out, is it, as you mentioned earlier about what's been happening with Medicaid in the state of Kansas and the growth in both medical inflation, which everybody's trying to figure out what to do about, and secondly, the caseloads. Secondly, you also mentioned that Kansas has quite a bit to do to shore up our Kansas public employee retirement system in the state of Kansas. It's fallen far behind. It's something like $8 billion in the hole for over the next 30 years. So if we can't control medical costs, which all states are facing, and we're dealing with the capers that would readily probably eat up any kind of revenue, that 2 or 3% revenue growth at this point. So what would happen to the inflationary costs that education is facing, or social services, or public safety, for that matter? And obviously a lot of people, schools particularly, look at 4 years of budget cuts that we've gone through in the state of Kansas and wonder if and when some of that is going to be made up, such as the mental health system that's in incredibly dire straits. So I guess the broad philosophical question is, what are the trade-offs in passing such a cap?
Well, let me try to hit several things here. First of all, the reason it was raised to 3% is you can do the calculations in your head and see that 2% wouldn't cover capers and Medicaid. At this point in time, to the senator's point that we have to study these things, I'm not sure 3% will cover it going forth. The point that's been trying to be made through this cap is that, as Professor Black said earlier, people throw money or do away with an income tax on the assumption it's going to result in more income for the state, more revenue for the state, and it doesn't always happen. So the Kansas theory is that we do it incrementally. We start with a certain amount of our revenue excess and buy down the income tax, and if we continue to produce excess revenues, we continue to buy it down. When we can't, we don't. So that is the basic theory. Now, I want to go back to something very quickly. Cutting the income tax on the small businesses is directly designed to get them to hire more people. Now, Professor Black will probably point out that we're going down a path that hasn't thoroughly been investigated. But the theory being is if they have more capital to invest in their businesses through retained earnings, and I think the professor and I would agree that capital investment is essential to business growth in most areas. If they have more capital to invest, the likelihood of them hiring people is better. And if you have 191,000 small businesses in the state of Kansas, which we do, and we have between 80 and 90,000 people unemployed, if we could just get a fourth of them to hire more people, we would cut in very deeply into our unemployment problem, which is...
And I'm hoping that this is 191,000 small businesses, but I think, that's obviously, it's 191,000 non-wage filers here.
Well,
and I think you have passive investors in some ways. You have, I had one representative tell me that he and his brother are part of the Family Farm Corporation. They own, a farm in Kansas. His brother lives in Texas. Are all these residents filers? I don't know. I've tried to ask some questions to get some detail on it, but
well, we have that many income tax reports filed. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's why I said if we could get 25% of them to hire people, it would cut into that significantly. Mm-hmm. And I will note something else. The unemployment problem in Kansas is regional. In our urban areas, especially western Kansas, we don't have an unemployment problem. It runs about 4% in many of those areas out there, which is, I think, technically full employment as I talk to economists. Other areas, particularly down around the Wichita area, it's still pretty high. We need a lot of help down in that area getting people back to work. So all of these things are designed to try to get people to invest in businesses in Kansas. And I understand Professor Black's point about not participating, but right now we're watching Oklahoma, and would be an excellent study, Professor Black, if you want to go look at it, who has been buying down their income tax. And as they buy down, their revenues have been growing faster than the buy down. And they've continued to buy down, and their goal is to be to 2.5% income tax by the end of this coming year. Well, Kansas feels a lot of pressure because it may be a zero-sum game, but these are our people. And to the point that was made earlier about poverty, government can be very successful in addressing the symptoms of poverty and helping people that are going through poverty, but government's not very good at reducing poverty. It takes jobs and work to reduce poverty. And so that is the goal that we're working towards, is job growth, capital investment. Hopefully that capital investment, and Senator Owens knows this from the business machinery and equipment debate, capital investment, if done properly, increases production. When you increase production, you increase the gross domestic output, and those things together create a higher standard of living. And that's what we're trying to move towards. Now, from the outside, we may look very clumsy, and maybe we are, but those are our goals, and we're doing our best to do that.
Quick informational note that the top income tax bracket in Kansas at this point, 6.45%. So do you have thoughts about the Senate bill and how this is fitting together?
Well, I kind of quite candidly followed pretty much with what the leadership in the Senate wanted to do with regard to that. I'm not on the tax committee. Unfortunately, I'd asked to be, but I'm the token attorney on the Federal and State Affairs Committee, which meets at the same time. So, you know, I don't know that we have had any final decision made on a lot of these things, but I'd say it's a wait and see with the wrap-up session that we're going to be facing.
Well, I guess then the follow-up question might be, the cost of the House bill is about, in 2013, is about $330 million. The cost of the, or I think that's the cost of the Senate bill. The cost of the House bill is like $230 million. I guess the kind of baseline question is, will that come off of, and we've been able to build ending balances in Kansas. The governor's looking at about $475 million for 2013. So if, is that the trade-off we're going to see? We're going to take that off ending balances in the state of Kansas so that we have half the ending balance that people have reported? Or does it mean that we go back into existing programs and existing budgets to find $200 to $300 million in cuts to make this work?
I don't think that's the plan at this point in time. And the governor has been meticulous in saying that Medicaid would not be cut and services would remain with the people that have them. And of course, and I don't want to get into this, but there's a managed care argument going on around that right now. But
that's another show, I think.
Yeah, but the House plan, when you remove, excuse me, if the conference committee removes the food sales tax section of it, is not that far in the red. But going forward,
that was only for 2013. When you look at 14, 15, 16, there's a kind of an exponential growth in loss of revenues.
Going forward, these plans have to generate revenues, because we're going to go from about, and I could be a little off on this, but I think our Medicaid caseload totals are something a little bit under $700 million at this point in time. In 2016, they're estimated to be over about 1.19 billion, I think. So we're going up rapidly, and we have to find revenue someplace to do this. That type of growth in our obligations tied in with our growth in our obligation to capers, which is probably going to double over that point in time, will be a great danger to other programs in the state of Kansas if we can't find a way to grow revenue fairly rapidly.
I think we have exhausted about all we can exhaust in terms of cutting program spending, cutting our programs. I think we have some programs that are in dire jeopardy right now if we continue to go that way. I think the ending fund balance approach is a much better one to go at this point. And we do need, I agree with the representative on finding a way to enhance our revenues, but I think we're going to have to be very, very careful about cutting any of the other programs that we have. People can't afford it. They can't survive if we do. So I'm going to be very, very cautious about any kind of votes that would be there to diminish any of those programs.
Well, Karen, you probably see these every day in your work with the agencies around Johnson County. And
yeah, and the thought that I've had as we've been talking about this is the thought that so often some of the decisions that get made are very short term rather than looking at the long term and where we make investments. You made the example of mental health. If we're not adequately treating that, that results in significant costs down the line to both public and government and individuals. Early learning's another example. If we were investing more in early learning programs, it would pay off huge rewards in the end. So, you know, I'd like to see more attention paid to what are the long-term benefits of the investments we're making, and shift dollars to or increase dollars in the overall pot that go in to those kinds of programs that in the long run can work towards building a stronger economy, because we are helping people become the kind of workers and skilled labor force that will contribute overall.
So Oklahoma is another example of the oil patch. I mean, it's a pretty simple explanation for Oklahoma. $100 barrel oil will do wonders for your state budget. And I don't think it has anything to do with reducing taxation. I would caution from the public finance perspective, whether it's 2 or 3%, this can be a very dangerous provision. Think if you had done this in Nevada. During the boom in real estate prices. The state coffers looked great because of the bubble. And you hit whatever you put it at, 3, 5, 6%, 8%, it would have hit. And it would have hit, and you would have stopped, and you would have put yourself in an immense deficit position when it all blew up. Now, Kansas, Missouri, we didn't experience the huge bubble to the extent of the rest of the nation. But it can happen. It can happen in commodities prices here, or it can happen in all the states we've been talking about in the oil patch. If they get very used to $100 barrel oil, well, people forget the price of oil can also go down. And it can go down very dramatically, in which case those states are in a world of hurt suddenly if they've locked in a revenue reduction model. So just from the public finance context, you know, when we teach it, we always say, you got to be really careful about going down that path.
And I agree with you, and that's why my preference has always been for House substitute for Senate Bill 1, which we passed last year. It is still in the Senate Tax Committee, no reflection on my friend, has not been worked, but it does not have that provision in it. It just says if you have this growth in revenues, you'll give this percentage of it to buying down. It doesn't have any other requirements. And so that was always my preference, but at this point in time, it's not part of the action of the conference committee, so I don't know that that's a possibility at this point in time, but certainly could be made conferenceable at any time.
I think what all the folks have been saying, though, is look forward a few years. If you don't get dramatic revenue increases, and if you don't find a way to stop the incredible rises in healthcare costs, not just in Kansas, nationwide, you have a state and local fiscal disaster. And you're not like the federal government. You know, the federal government has its own currency. It can and has run a deficit 98% of its existence, right? States and localities can't do that. And so I think we all agree now is the time to take seriously, sometimes Kansas can't address things like healthcare costs, perhaps. That probably needs a national answer, right? But it's incumbent on all of us to push for that national answer now rather than waiting 3 years when we're going to all wake up to a disaster.
I think we have just a couple minutes left, and maybe give each of you, half a minute to kind of give some final thoughts or observations on what happens now.
What happens now? Well, we go back, and I may have the date wrong here, but I think we return on the 25th.
25th.
Right.
And there's a myriad of conference committees that still have work to do. For our purposes here, we will be watching the Tax Conference Committee. Chairman Donovan and Chairman Carlson will work hard to craft a bill that can pass both houses, and that is no mean task. And in my opinion, something like House Substitute for Senate Bill 1 might be a more acceptable bill because it doesn't have what some people regard as a cap and things like that in it.
Well, I agree. We're going to have to roll up our sleeves and really get to work on the 25th. We still have a budget to do. We still have redistricting to do in an election year. I chair the redistricting committee on the Senate side, and I can tell you we're not that close yet to getting an agreement. You have all of those things, and then in the middle of that, you've got the tax issues that have to be determined as well. CAPERS has to be determined. K through 12 education funding has to be determined. And Medicaid is there. So with these huge issues, and we have 17 days left in the number of days that are allocated from a budgetary standpoint to get that done.
I think we only have less than a minute to go. From a research and informational viewpoint, for people who are interested in this, a website that you can go to look up for the Kansas legislature is www.kslegislature.org, and you can get the tax facts out of Kansas Legislative Research and the bills that we've talked about. You can look at them specifically to see how they would apply to you. A final thought, Karen?
I think just as the legislature continues its work, that I would encourage that there is consideration in thinking about how our lower income working families are impacted by all of these, both on the revenue and the expenditure side.
Thank you all for your time and insight and very troubling and dynamic questions before the Kansas legislature.